Donald Trump walks into a lonely funeral. What he does next no one expected. The rain fell in a slow, steady drizzle, soaking through William Hawthorne's worn trench coat as he stood motionless by the open grave. His fingers curled into a sharp salute, his eyes locked on the flag-draped coffin being lowered into the earth. No family stood nearby. No voices whispered grief. No eulogies were spoken. Just the hollow sound of dirt hitting wood, the final chapter of another forgotten life. The priest mumbled a closing prayer, his voice barely audible over the wind. The gravediggers, familiar with the routine, worked quickly. William remained rigid and unflinching, his breath slow and measured. He had seen this scene play out too many times to count. Lonely funerals for men who had once stood on distant battlefields, men who had fought, bled, and suffered for a country that no longer remembered their names. He had made it his life's duty to remember for them. The cemetery, vast and quiet, stretched in every direction. Rows of simple headstones, names barely known beyond the walls of the military records that housed them. He had buried hundreds over the years, watching as each one faded into history, without a soul to mourn their passing. The thought had once enraged him. Now it only left him numb. A groundskeeper approached hesitantly, nodding toward the grave. "You knew him?" William didn't look away. "No." The worker frowned, shifting uncomfortably before stepping back, leaving him to his silent vigil. He exhaled slowly, lowering his hand. His joints ached, but he ignored it. Time had taken its toll on his body, but he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. Not when so many had been abandoned to the quiet of the earth, their sacrifices reduced to government paperwork. He turned to leave, his boots heavy against the wet grass. Tomorrow there would be another, and another after that. Until one day, someone would stand at his grave. Or maybe no one at all. The rain continued to fall. Somewhere in the world, life moved on. And in a cemetery no one visited, another soldier was lost to time. For now, the rain drummed against the White House windows as President Donald Trump leaned over his desk, flipping through reports marked with red insignias. Intelligence briefings, economic forecasts, military updates, all necessary, all urgent. He absorbed them with sharp efficiency, marking notes in the margins, his mind moving 3 steps ahead. But then, an envelope slipped onto his desk, distinct from the others. No official seal, no high-ranking sender. Just a simple, creased letter. He picked it up, unfolding the worn paper. The words inside were unpolished, written by someone who wasn't accustomed to addressing a president. But the message hit harder than any policy document. It was from a funeral home worker, a man who had seen too many veterans buried in silence. He spoke of empty cemeteries, of men who had given everything for their country only to die, with no one left to care. No families. No last words spoken over their graves. Forgotten. He mentioned a name, William Hawthorne. A man who had made it his duty to stand in place of those lost to history, attending funerals no one else would. The letter wasn't asking for help. It wasn't begging for change. It was simply a statement, a quiet plea disguised as an observation. Trump sat back in his chair, gripping the paper. For a long moment he said nothing. The usual rhythm of the Oval Office hummed around him, the occasional murmur of staff outside the door, the distant ring of phones. None of it registered. His fingers tightened around the letter. "No one should die forgotten," he muttered. The words were low, almost to himself. He glanced at the flag standing in the corner of the room, the symbol of a nation built on the sacrifices of men like the ones in the letter. He pressed the intercom. "Give me a full report on William Hawthorne," he said. "And find out when the next funeral is." There was a pause on the other end. His staff was used to urgent requests, but this one was different. "Sir, next funeral?" "You heard me?" His voice was steady, leaving no room for question. Still, he knew how Washington worked. If this became public, it would turn into a media spectacle. Journalists would flood the cemeteries, Political opponents would twist it into something it wasn't. He wanted none of that. No press. No cameras. No official statement. He would go alone. The wind swept through Arlington Cemetery, rustling the rows of white headstones like whispered voices from the past. William Hawthorne stood at the edge of yet another open grave, his coat pulled tight against the cold. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray over the small gathering of cemetery staff who had long since stopped questioning why he came. The casket rested in front of him, draped in the stars and stripes, ready to be lowered into the earth. No family, no friends, no visitors. Just him. He took a step closer, the damp soil shifting beneath his worn boots. The name on the simple plaque read Sergeant Daniel Reese. A name the world would forget by tomorrow. But William wouldn't. "You mattered, soldier," he whispered. His voice, rough from years of quiet grief, barely carried over the wind. He gave a slow, practiced salute, his arm steady despite the weight of time pressing down on his bones. Then footsteps. William tensed. Visitors were rare at these burials. He turned slightly, expecting a cemetery worker, perhaps a distant acquaintance who had arrived too late. But what he saw made his breath catch. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, was walking toward him. Alone. No press. No motorcade. No flashing cameras. Just a man in a dark overcoat, his golden hair tousled slightly by the wind. William's heart pounded against his ribs. He had met senators, generals, and secretaries in his time, but none had ever set foot here. He blinked, certain his mind was playing tricks on him, but the figure only came closer, his step steady, purposeful. Trump stopped beside him, silent for a moment as he looked down at the casket. His expression was unreadable, his hands resting at his sides. The wind howled between the graves, filling the silence that stretched between them. William swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Mr. President," the words barely left his mouth. "What are you doing here?" Trump exhaled slowly, his gaze locked on the flag covering the coffin. "Same thing you are." William searched his face for some sign of a publicity stunt, some ulterior motive, but found nothing. The weight in Trump's eyes was real. He wasn't here for show. The president straightened. Then, to William's astonishment, lifted his hand in a sharp salute. The two men stood side by side, honoring a soldier neither of them had known, yet both refused to let be forgotten. For the first time in years, William wasn't alone. Trump reached up and removed his hat, holding it against his chest as he bowed his head. The wind carried the silence between them, heavy and unbroken. The cemetery stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of white headstones, standing in rigid formation like soldiers still on duty. The weight of it settled over him, a feeling that went beyond words, beyond politics, beyond anything that had brought him here before. William stood beside him, hands clenched at his sides. His throat felt tight, and when he spoke, his voice cracked in a way that embarrassed him. "They have no one," he said, barely above a whisper. Trump didn't turn. He didn't need to. "Not anymore," he replied, the words low and firm. William swallowed, pressing his lips together. He had spent years accepting this reality, the cold truth that some men died alone, that the world moved on without looking back. But here was the President of the United States standing before an unmarked grave, treating this soldier as though he were the only man who had ever mattered. The casket remained between them, unmoving, waiting. William had watched hundreds lowered into the earth, had heard the final scrape of dirt against wood so many times that it no longer haunted him. He had told himself it didn't affect him anymore. But for the first time in years, something was shifting. "You do this often?" Trump asked, his voice quieter now, the sharpness softened by something deeper. William exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Every time they bring one in. No family, no friends, just me." His fingers twitched slightly as he forced himself to admit it aloud. "I don't know them. Never met most of them. But they deserve something." even if it's just one person showing up. Trump's expression didn't change, but William could tell he was listening. Really listening. How many? The president asked. William hesitated, then sighed. Too many? A long silence stretched between them. The wind picked up, rippling the flag draped over the casket, lifting it just enough to show a glimpse of the polished wood beneath. Trump reached out and pressed the fabric back down, smoothing it with careful precision. His fingers lingered for just a second before he straightened. Every single one, he said. William blinked. Sir? Trump turned to him fully now, the weight of his presence settling like an undeniable force. Every single soldier buried alone. I want their names. All of them. William's breath hitched. He had expected a kind word, a solemn nod, maybe even a handshake, before the president walked away. But this wasn't something he had ever dared to hope for. Trump's jaw was set, his eyes unreadable. Can you do that for me? William forced himself to find his voice. Yes, sir. Trump nodded once, sharp and final. Good. Because this doesn't happen again. The funeral wasn't over yet, but in that moment, William knew something had just changed forever. The room was silent as Trump's voice cut through the tension. The White House Situation Room, usually buzzing with overlapping discussions and the tapping of keyboards, now held only the weight of his words. The highest-ranking military officials sat around the table, their faces unreadable, waiting for him to continue. He leaned forward, both hands resting on the polished surface, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. No American soldier dies forgotten, he said. From now on, every veteran buried alone will receive full military honors. A brief pause. Then movement, generals shifting, aides exchanging glances, notes being scribbled at a frantic pace. It wasn't resistance. It was shock. The logistics of such an order were staggering. Thousands of forgotten graves. Hundreds of unclaimed bodies every year. Military funerals required precision, resources, coordination. But no one in the room dared object. A 4-star general cleared his throat. Sir, that would require... I don't care what it requires. Trump interrupted, his voice sharp but calm. Make it happen. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Calls were made. Orders drafted. Plans were set into motion before anyone had even left their seats. It was happening. Meanwhile, across the city, William sat at his kitchen table, a black and white photo of a soldier resting beneath his fingertips. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. He let it ring once, twice, before lifting the receiver. A voice he never expected filled the line. Mr. Hawthorne, this is the Secretary of Defense. William said nothing. I wanted to personally thank you, the voice continued. Your work, your dedication, it won't be in vain. The President has made sure of that. William gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. For years, he had stood alone, believing his efforts existed in the shadows, unseen and unrecognized. And now, his quiet mission was shaping national policy. He cleared his throat. I don't do this for recognition, sir. I know, the secretary said. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve it. The line clicked dead a moment later. William sat still, the weight of it settling over him. Back in the Oval Office, Trump stood near the window, staring at the cemetery grounds in the distance. His aide waited, pen poised over his schedule. Sir, your itinerary for tomorrow? Trump didn't turn. His voice was steady. One more thing, he said. I'm attending another funeral. The aide hesitated. Alone, sir? Trump exhaled. No, he said. Not this time. The air was crisp, the sky an endless stretch of blue, but the atmosphere was heavy with something deeper. Arlington Cemetery, once the setting for quiet, lonely burials, now stood alive with movement. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, their dress uniforms sharp, flags clutched tightly in their hands. Veterans, young and old, filled the space, some leaning on canes, others standing tall with medals glinting in the morning sun. Civilians gathered in silence, families with no direct ties to the fallen, yet drawn by something they couldn't ignore. William Hawthorne had never seen anything like it. He stood near the front, eyes scanning the sea of faces. This was the same cemetery, the same hallowed ground where so many had been buried alone. But today, everything was different. The flag-draped casket rested before them, identical to the hundreds before it. Yet this time, it was more than just a coffin. It was a symbol, the embodiment of every soldier who had ever been forgotten. Then movement. Donald Trump stepped forward. No cameras flanked him. No journalists hovered, waiting for sound bites. He wasn't here as a politician. He was here as a man who had made a promise. The crowd fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing into their chests. Trump looked at the casket for a long moment before speaking. "These men and women gave everything for us," he said, his voice steady, clear. "And we forgot them. That ends today." A breeze lifted the flag draped over the casket. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bugle stood ready, waiting for the call of taps. Trump's words carried through the cemetery, each one deliberate. He spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of the silent debt that had gone unpaid for far too long. He didn't mention politics. He didn't talk about policies or programs. He talked about men who had bled for this country, who had been left to fade into history without so much as a whispered thank you. And the world listened. A young soldier in the crowd reached for his phone, hands shaking as he began recording. He wasn't the only one. The footage spread, live-streamed to millions. People across the country paused, watching in stunned silence as the President of the United States stood before a forgotten grave and told the world the truth. The comment sections filled with regret, with sorrow, with the overwhelming realization of what had been lost. William stood still, heart pounding. He had fought for this for so long, carried the weight of it alone, and now finally, the world saw what he had seen all these years. His chest tightened, not with grief, but with something else, something he hadn't felt in decades. Trump turned to an aide, who handed him a simple sheet of paper. He unfolded it, the names printed in clean, bold letters. No ranks, no medals, just names. And then, one by one, he began to read them. A hush fell over the crowd. The list was long, and yet Trump's voice never wavered. Every name mattered. Every name was spoken as though it belonged to someone he had known personally. William closed his eyes. The weight of years of standing alone in the cold, of whispering words over graves that no one else would visit, it all began to lift. Today, they were remembered. Finally, they were remembered. The change was swift, unstoppable. What had once been a quiet, lonely duty became a national commitment. Every forgotten veteran now received full military honors, their sacrifices acknowledged at last. The once empty services were now filled with soldiers standing in salute, families stepping forward to claim the legacies they never knew existed. No name would ever go unspoken again. William Hawthorne watched it all unfold from a distance. The weight he had carried for years was no longer his alone. The burden had been lifted, his mission complete. He attended fewer funerals now, not because he had given up, but because he no longer needed to stand alone. The silence had been replaced by the sound of a nation finally remembering. One evening, as he sat on his porch, watching the sun fade into the horizon, a letter arrived. No official stamp, no grand insignia, just a few words written in steady, familiar handwriting. You did your part. Now rest. Donald J. Trump. Far from the public eye, under the dim glow of Arlington's lights, Trump stood before the memorial wall. His fingers traced the engraved names, thousands of them, stretching into eternity. He had kept his word, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He exhaled slowly, voice barely above a whisper. I won't forget you. The wind carried his words into the night. across the country, the footage of that funeral still played in millions of homes. The names still echoed. And, for the first time in history, America did not look away. Please click on one of the videos on your screen to watch another story celebrating the human spirit. If you enjoy meaningful stories, please subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on our latest uploads. Thanks for being a part of Unbroken Stories.